Our first session today is The Hewitt Review, Implications and Next Steps. Please welcome Patricia Hewitt to the stage, along with our panel speakers and session chair, Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation.
Great, well, welcome everyone. It's fantastic to see such an amazing turnout, and I think that tells us something about how much importance people are attaching to Patricia's review, the response to it, and where we go next. So let me tell you how we're going to use the time. We've got 40 minutes or so together. I'm going to ask our panel to reflect on the response to Patricia's report, but that was also a response to the report of the Health and Social Care Select Committee. So I'm going to ask Steve Brine, MP, who's the chair of that committee, also to respond to say what he thought of the response that we saw yesterday. And then I'm going to turn to Joe Rafferty, Chief Executive of Mersey Care, who's very involved working with Patricia on the review, and Steve Russell, who's Chief Delivery Officer of NHS England, to kind of reflect on where we go next in the light of the response that we've had from government, from the department. And then we'll just see how the conversation rolls on. But it's important that there's going to be a good time for you to ask any questions that you want to ask before we finish. So, Patricia, the one thing one can say about your process is it's been nicely contained. I mean, you know, it feels like we've been talking about your review for a while, but it was only set up, what, 7 or 8 months ago? You
Less.
did all the work in 4 or 5 months, and you've had a response in relatively, a few weeks as well. So, I mean, it's been an amazing journey. So, how do you respond to the response? I think the most overused word in this session will be the word respond. But yeah, how do you respond to the response?
Matthew, thank you. Let me just start by thanking everybody here this morning who contributed to the review. You mentioned Joe, co-chair of one of the work streams, but over 1,000 individuals were directly involved in the review. So I've always felt, with the support I had from the Confed and from many, over 400 organisations, this is our review, not my review. And I'm really pleased by the government's response. I think it's very thoughtful. It shows real joined-up working across government, which is one of the things we've all been calling for and stressed in the review. To be honest, it's more positive than I'd expected a few points along the way. And although they haven't accepted every recommendation, it would have been a complete miracle if they had done. I mean, that's not what happens with any of these reviews. I think what is absolutely clear is the real support for integrated care systems and a real understanding that integrated care systems and health itself are about far more than the NHS. You know, the role the NHS plays, as we know, and as Amanda was saying yesterday, is absolutely vital. But it is only part, indeed it's only a small part, of what makes up the health and well-being that each of us enjoy or don't enjoy throughout our lives. So that recognition of the nature of integrated care systems, the potential we have, the difference we're already making, that's absolutely critical. And I think with this response to the review, with what we were hearing yesterday from Wes Streeting and some of the other statements that have been made recently from the opposition, what is really clear is we have got the cross-party support for integrated care systems that I referenced in the review. We've got that, we've got the legislation, we are here to stay, and we've got the policy stability that should make everybody who might have been hesitating a bit about whether or not really to commit to their local system, their local partnership, their local integrated care board. Now, put aside all of those doubts, get stuck in, and let's make this the great success that we're already showing it can be.
Thanks, Patricia. And I ought to have said, just in case anybody doesn't know, that, of course, Patricia is also chair of Norfolk and Waveney ICB. Steve, the government's response was also a response to the report of your Health and Social Care Committee. Do you share Patricia's broad welcome of that?
Look, we're a cross-party committee, so we'll go through it with a fine-tooth comb in the coming weeks, and then we'll respond to the response of the response. Look, I was at DH with Jeremy and then Matt as a minister when we were developing STPs that obviously became the integrated care systems. I clearly believe in them. I clearly believe in their approach, and I completely agree with Patricia that that yes, the response did not say we no longer believe in these systems. I personally believe these are the last big reform. You'll be pleased to hear. I think they are the last big reform of the NHS, and they are here to stay. I think my initial reading of the response is, yes, there's lots of acceptance of the recommendations that we both made, but a lot of that is stuff that is already happening. So just to give you an example, outcome-based targets, which we talked about. The government acknowledges the importance of outcome-based targets and agrees that other measures and targets may be needed. So we take that, being a half-full kind of guy that I am, as acceptance of the recommendation. We talked a lot about leadership of the ICSs. Yes. The government tie that into the messenger review around future leadership of the ICSs and where the power will lie. And that's good, but that's still on a promise of work to be done. So my view of ICSs is, and I think they're a bit like the England football team. There's a strong management thread that runs through it. There's really great talent in the squad, but as yet, they haven't won anything. And I think that the challenge now is to take them forward. And I heard the stuff that was said yesterday, and I heard what Amanda Pritchard said about being careful. I think she said we need to be thoughtful before interfering with ICSs, and I heard what the Shadow Health Secretary said about that. But equally, what I don't want to happen is, I don't want these ICSs to embed, and then we look at it 5 years down the line, and we get into we do it this way because we've always done it this way. I want to get that right from the start, which is why the outcomes framework is good. So my critique is, much done, more to do, as somebody once said, Patricia.
Absolutely.
And I like the idea that obviously there's a strong focus on prevention, and they obviously very bought into the major conditions strategy, and they see the ICS as a clear role in that. But just finally, Matthew, to give you an example, yesterday I was guesting on Philip Dunn's Environmental Audit Select Committee, which is looking at air quality. Now, the Environment Act puts some pretty clear national priorities around air quality targets. But the minister's response will be, it's for ICSs to decide their response in that space. My view would be, that's national policy that's been legislated by government in an act of Parliament, and therefore it is reasonable for us as scrutineers of government to expect the government's arm of delivery, ICSs, to implement that policy in the Environment Act. So our report was all about a balance between command and control and local leadership. And where that balance falls, I think the jury's still out.
This is work in progress.
Yeah.
And statutory ICSs are less than a year old.
Exactly.
So, and we're moving from a completely different policy regime to a new one. And I think what's really interesting about your report, my report, the overlap between them and this response, is the way it's opened the door to the next stage of development. So we undoubtedly, I think most of us, certainly in integrated care systems, would say, we need a national outcomes framework, but we need far fewer top-down national targets.
Yeah.
That, I think, the government has accepted. We'll see what happens next. But if that changes in the mandate, that changes the whole context for the planning guidance, that recognition that integrated care systems, they're not just a delivery arm. In fact, they're not primarily, I think, a delivery arm for government. They're there to respond to local population needs and work with the benefit of national support, best practice, the right policy framework and the rest of it, to get better health outcomes for our residents, particularly those who've been most left behind.
And if ministers are saying, look, we believe in prevention, that's easy to say. We all believe in prevention. If that is a policy direction, and they say that, and they want to see ICSs make sure that alongside the day job of waiting lists and all the stuff that sits on the day list task, that they want to make sure that prevention of ill health is central to what ICSs do, then they'll have my 150% support.
I'm clearly failing my audition as chair of question time here because I've completely lost control of my panel, but
only half of it.
So Steve, Steve Ross, Chief Delivery Officer, National Director for Vaccinations and Screening at NHS England. So Steve, it seems to me we exist here now in relation to kind of two different kind of challenging polarities. On the one hand, there's one that we recognise, and that's between kind of national accountability around national priorities, like things like waiting lists, for example, and the kind of notions of devolution. So that's a well-recognised kind of pull and push between central priorities, central national accountability and local discretion. But we've now got the second dimension that Patricia refers to, which is kind of accountability within the NHS and then accountability more widely into local government, third sector. And one of the kind of peculiarities of where we are is that we have bodies now, integrated care partnerships, and places which are mini partnerships. They look more like partnerships than ICBs. They are multi-agency. And in a sense, they exist in an accountability and support vacuum. It's not clear who they're accountable to, and it's not clear where the support mechanisms are for them. So this is a kind of complex picture. So taking up, I guess, Steve and Patricia's point, which is, well, the important thing now is what happens next. What do you take from the response that we saw yesterday, and what for NHSE, what are now the kind of priorities?
Thanks, Matthew. Maybe to take a step back before dealing with that. So I think from an NHS England perspective, we were really pleased to see Patricia's review. It was incredibly helpful to hear and to listen to some of the discussions that led to the document itself, because actually the review is a product, Patricia, as you say, of hours of discussions with many, many colleagues, and we were privileged to be part of that in many ways. I think it has really helpfully shone a light on work that was already in progress, but also shown where there is more to do. And to your point earlier, I think we kind of need to move away from responding to the response and focus on, so what, exactly your point, Matthew, so what happens next? And I think, again, the message from both the review and the government's response yesterday, and from an NHS England perspective, is wholehearted backing for integrated care systems, and importantly, the four purposes of integrated care systems. And so, I think for us at NHS England, we'd said and recognised a while back there was much that we needed to do as we reshape our organisation and reshape the way in which we interact with integrated care systems and integrated care boards to kind of streamline and simplify the architecture that sits around integrated care systems, but also to kind of purposefully shift the way in which we interact with integrated care systems. Moving from perhaps what people have experienced in the past to a broader conversation, so it's not just about waiting lists, although I would suggest, and I think, Patricia, your review highlights this, that actually there's not that much difference between national and local priorities. They are the same in many, many, many respects. There, of course, will be different emphasis in different places reflecting the needs of the population. So I think for us at NHS England, it is working with colleagues up and down the country in the integrated care systems to make changes to the oversight framework, our operating model in the way that we started, but need to bring to life. And I think we could spend a lot of time on wiring diagrams. I think what is probably more important is, again, the section in Patricia's report on leadership and relationships. So really good integrated care systems have strong mutual trust, high challenge, built on good relationships within places and between places in the integrated care system more broadly, and a sense of mutual accountability to each other. And actually, I think Patricia's point on thinking about what the Messenger Review said and then looking at this from an improvement perspective and a relationship perspective is where we should probably concentrate our efforts. Simplifying our interactions and simplifying the oversight arrangements is important because it should help bring balance to the priorities that we talk about. But my personal view is redoing the wiring diagram is only a very small part of what needs to happen next in terms of that point on accountability.
And Steve, I mean, I think it's almost impossible to overstate the challenges that NHS England is having to face at the moment, going through really profound internal change in terms of reduction in headcount. And I think, when you're in a part of a large organisation, sometimes the behaviours within the organisation differ from one part of the organisation to the other, depending on the different kind of priorities that people have. We know that different regions have a more or less permissive feel towards systems, for example. So here you are with this cultural challenge, which is an expectation on the one hand that you'll give power in a kind of devolutionary sense away to systems, and on the other hand that you'll give power away laterally to other bits of government, other agencies. That is a massive kind of cultural shift. How confident are you and you're doing that in the context of, as everybody knows, pretty intensive pressure from the department? How confident are you that cultural shift is accomplished? I mean, it's so difficult.
Yeah, so I am confident about the commitment of NHS England to make progress in that context. I think it is fair to say, and it's not just NHS England that are going through big change. Integrated care boards themselves, having only just established as a statutory set of organisations, also have to change, both in terms of size, but also in terms of function, because ICBs were effectively created through a lift and shift of colleagues who'd been part of CCGs. And actually, Joe and I were chatting earlier and saying actually it's really unusual but very helpful to have a review of newly created organisations at such an early stage. But it's useful to take stock, step back and say, how do we want this to work? So I think it's a set of change for the whole of the NHS and its partners. I'm not going to sit here and suggest that I think this is a flicker light switch moment and suddenly everything changes. We're going through this in effect phases. We've got a new organisational design that we are moving to, which will make us a smaller organisation. Hopefully that will help us be more focused, more purposeful. We're a different organisation because we've got Health Education England and its digital functions within it. And we have set out an operating model that we are committed to, but will involve a huge change in mindset, attitudes and behaviours for both NHS England, but also throughout the NHS system more broadly. Amanda, you'll have heard Amanda say this. We launched NHS Impact recently, which is all about thinking about life from an improvement and transformation lens. We have committed that that is going to be how we work. Amanda has committed that all of the colleagues within NHS England will be supported and trained in that sort of methodology. But if you look at any other organisation that has adopted that approach, it does take time, it takes years. So I am confident about our commitment. I am absolutely certain that our colleagues in integrated care boards will continue to work with us on it. This is a partnership, not just about NHS England. And the ongoing dialogue really helps, exactly as you say, Matthew, shine a light on where our consistency is less consistent than we would like, and we will continue to be quite purposeful about that. But, I mean, let's be clear and let's be fair to colleagues in NHS England. to a degree. People have been asked to do a job in a certain way for a very long time.
Yeah.
And we're asking people now to do a slightly different job and in a very different way. And we shouldn't underestimate how difficult that is in many contexts.
Thanks, Steve. So Joe Rafferty, Chief Executive of Merseycare Foundation Trust. Joe, in many ways, I see you as a leader who exemplifies many of the principles in Patricia's report. You know, you're committed to working at a system in place. You put a lot of emphasis on prevention, on relationships beyond the health service. How did the responses that we got yesterday, where does that lead you to feel there are now new opportunities? How do you think this needs to be taken forward?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Matthew. I think one of the most frequently asked questions colleagues of mine, other chief executives in the system have said is, well, do we think ICSs are here to stay? And I think, Patricia, you said just this morning, we're here to stay. That's a key recommendation that's embedded here. And I think people will have listened to that. You know, some people I think maybe thought ICSs would be transitional, maybe hoped they would be, I don't know. And as chief executives in the NHS, I guess we're a bell curve. There are people who want to engage in new types of reforms. There are people who will wait and see. And there are people who just, at this stage, are not convinced. But I think, and I'm 100% with Steve on this one, I think the recommendations take us from a place where it's a sort of vertical, almost a transactional wiring type diagram to say, right, we're here to stay. The job now is to build relationships. There is no divide in the commissioner-provider sector anymore. So that's a huge challenge for us to work out how locally we're going to do different things with resources. But I think the recommendations now sort of clear the landscape a bit for that piece. Now, that sounds like nothing's been happening, but Patricia, as we walked in, you said, it's the same experience I have, everybody stops you and says, by the way, this is what we're doing and this is how it's working. And so there is a huge level of informal change going on at this stage. I think the recommendations now help us put that in the sort of accountability and delivery framework. My hope is that, and having sat through many NHS reforms in my time, that this is the one where we're able to say that this is going to be run on the basis of really strong relationships, of trust, of mutual risk management. And those are really easy words to say, but very difficult things to achieve in reality. From my perspective of having co-chaired one of the prevention and population health management stream, what struck me was the massive learning we already have from 25 years worth of, I think maybe Patricia, from your own time as Secretary of State, when a lot of this stuff was really properly talked about. I think we've got a great opportunity there. There's a lot of knowledge in the system already. We talked a lot about population health management and the sort of new and more sophisticated techniques to think about populations, not just from their health perspective, but from their quality of life perspective. So let's just not think in solving a health problem, you make somebody's life better. You know, they can still live miserably in poverty. So that opportunity to bring that to life, I think, might have taken us a long time to develop lots of the skills and techniques, but gosh, in the evidence we took, there are so many ICBs that are bringing that to life right now. So my hope is we can now push ahead full steam. I hope that ICBs will now look at the 4 key objectives they have and start to balance those out. You know, a lot of the prevention stuff must be done locally. It can be guided nationally, for sure, but must be done locally. And I think the thing that we might need to pay some attention to is what I would call near-time prevention and distant, longer-term primary prevention. I think lots of colleagues in the NHS and the provider sector at this stage were finding it difficult to lift our eyes from the fire. And we all know we need to call a fire brigade. And I think we all know what one looks like. It's prevention-shaped. But I hope that we can start to have a conversation about some near-term solutions. We might call them secondary prevention. And that's going to take a bit of dialogue with local authority people who understandably really get the sort of determinants of health piece. So I hope we'll get the plans out now that are properly thought through in the near, medium and short term on prevention. I can't see any reason we can't do that now.
Thanks, Joe. So I'm keen to bring in questions in the room. So I'm going to ask the panel one question, which I'm going to ask them to respond to quite briefly. But please think about any question that you'd want to ask, because I'm going to be coming to you in 3 or 4 minutes. So I guess the question I want to ask you, because it's really fascinating having a kind of politician, chair of a system, leading figure in HSE, chief executive of a trust. Actually, you'll look at this from different perspectives. So I just wanted to ask you, what is the one kind of wicked issue in all of this? If there's a broad consensus around the direction we want to go in, what is the kind of chewiest, most difficult issue that's got to be dealt with here? So Steve, starting with you, in terms of Whitehall and politics, you know, we're moving into the idea of taking forward devolution when you've got a general election looming is pretty counterintuitive, let's face it. And that's not a point about this government, but any government.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, I think I can say this indiscreetly, but, you know, Patricia took over a department which hadn't made a difficult decision about closing a hospital for 2 years because, you know, why would you? You had a general election coming up, you know. So, you know, we know the pressures that exist in a kind of election period. So what do you see as being the kind of the most chewy and difficult issue for politicians and Whitehall if we are going to take forward this ICS agenda in the way that you've advocated in your report?
Because there are so many people on the waiting list, because, you know, if you put a group of politicians in the room, constituency MPs, and ask them how many people have got constituents on the waiting list, every hand would go up. If you ask them how many people are waiting for NHS dental care, both hands for everybody would go up. You know, so the day job, those day-to-day issues are the challenge. And, you know, I thought Joe used the word relationships right. So just to go back to my football analogy, the challenge for the systems is to keep the whole squad happy. So when I talk to my system in the area that I represent, and I talk to others in the course of our work, and we had so much input for which I'm incredibly grateful, you know, and one of the recommendations is around public health representations on the boards. So the government recently released the primary care plan. Very important to them in terms of delivery of the primary care, the 8 a.m. squeeze. They talked about pharmacists and how important community pharmacists are to that. And yet, in evidence, I was staggered in how many times I asked ICBs, and there was no pharmacy representation on those boards. So those relationships are critical, and how you keep everybody happy and everybody inside the tent is the devil's own job, and that's one that you now have. But your chewy issues are the stuff that moves the dial as far as the electorate's concerned is not who's on the IC board, is not the long-term prevention strategy and whether we allow GPs to prescribe digital answers to people with long-term sleep challenges, which have all sorts of long-term health implications. It's how many people on the waiting list can you see an NHS dentist? That's the chewy issue. And you know, the Secretary of State, I would imagine today, will be very retail in what he says because he fully appreciates there's an election next year.
So, Patricia, taking off your hat of leader of the Hewitt Review, but putting on your hat as chair of Norfolk and Waveney Integrated Care Board, in terms of demonstrating the value added of systems at this particular juncture, this difficult political time, this difficult time of really ambitious expectations in terms of performance and finance that have been placed on every part of the system, what is the trickiest issue that you've got to focus on, do you think?
Rather, as Steve was saying, the most difficult thing is managing today, improving today, and transforming and building for tomorrow. And it's doing those two things simultaneously when we are hit by multiple demands, multiple challenges, boing, 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 just taken over responsibility for dentistry, community pharmacy, and. And what I find, you know, I see in my own system and I see in many others, is despite the fact that we are having to do all this and radically restructure and downsize our own organisations, frankly, too much, too fast, all at the same time, you know, certainly in Norfolk and Waveney, we are leaning into this, we are owning all these difficulties as another opportunity to do these two things simultaneously. And what we know is that you don't fix ambulance queues or doctors' queues or a whole bunch of other queues simply by focusing on those queues. They are symptoms, they're not the underlying problem. And therefore, a critical part of how we make the coming winter better for our residents and our staff than it was last year. And last year we had much more, last winter we had much more collaboration than we'd had a year ago or 6 years ago. So the coming winter, one of the ways in which we will, I believe, make it better for our residents is we will do more to keep particularly our older people out of hospital in the first place. Because doing that by working differently with our primary care colleagues and many, many others, including the voluntary sector, that is actually the most sustainable answer to the ambulance queues. But it's got to deliver results this winter as well as lay the foundations.
I think we're worried on the committee for you and the system of the 30%, you talk about restructuring, the 30% reduction is coming out. So very quick example, you know, the stuff that came out the other day around choice, the choice agenda, and using the independent sector to battle those waiting lists. Systems have told me that they're pulling back from that spend because of that reduction. That's going to make that choice still undeliverable. And that choice agenda has been there for a decade. It just hasn't been exercised, as I said in the House when we announced this. So we have the Secretary of State in before the Select Committee next Tuesday afternoon, and we're going to be asking him about that. So anybody who wants to grab me and prime me with questions for next Tuesday afternoon, I'm all ears.
Great, thank you. So that's really interesting, Steve, that Steve has said, well, that the critical issue is to be delivering on those things which are inevitably political priorities. Patricia's talked about maybe focusing on the difference that collaboration can make to next winter. You know, when you've got a really complex, challenging situation, you have to kind of say, well, what is the specific and concrete thing that we've got to focus on in this, and what do you see as being that for NHS England in this next 18 months, in the kind of challenging environment you're going to be in leading up to the election? What is the thing that you think is absolutely the heart of trying to get this right?
Nice, easy question. Thank you.
And you've got 1 minute.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say that the wicked bit of this is maintaining balance and managing burden. And what I mean by that is maintaining balance across what is in front of us, but also thinking about the slightly more medium and longer term piece. So we have to continue to talk about and think about all of the four, not just two of the four. Because actually what you focus on and what you talk about matters. And then the second thing is managing burden. So every part of the system is under pressure, and we need to try and make sure there is enough headroom to tackle all of them. Just if you give an example of the maintaining balance. So on prevention, the NHS does a lot on prevention already. One of the questions just to consider, which is my other sort of interest, what's the balance of time spent on elective and A&E in a conversation in the ICB, ICS, compared to vaccination and screening, which, by the way, vaccination is the second most powerful and effective public health intervention, second only to clean water.
Interesting, really interesting. So, Joe, for you, in terms of, there you are running a trust, short-term operational pressures, but also very much focused on the long-term and being a part of your system. What for you is the kind of core issue that would kind of is the most wicked issue, or the issue that's going to unlock things for you?
I think the biggest challenge we face is how do we redistribute resource, let me put it that way. That could be money, it could be people, it could be infrastructure, it could be digital capability. There's all sorts of ways you can interpret that. But presently we have too much stuff locked in different silos. And however we choose to do that, we've got to get some freedoms in place. It may be too much to shift money out of providers into even short-term preventive measures, but if we can start to think about how we use let's say, our knowledge capabilities to look at what we all think are different problems. Frankly, they're the same problem. You know, so in Liverpool, we've looked at using the population health management techniques, a group of people that we call complex lives. They've got the super used mental health services, general practice, A&E. They're super users of the police services, of education, of social care. You look at that group, it's eminently manageable in a different way. And it's I think, one of the things ICBs should focus on. That'll give us a couple of things. Much better use of resource, so we save money in this. We provide a better service to those particular client group, and actually will take the pressure away and allow the sort of patient flow. And now it's not rocket science actually to begin to think about that stuff, but it will require us to start doing that allocative efficiency stuff. And I think we've got to do that in a way where we don't scare the horses. So it's not about taking money away, but it's breaking the barriers down and allowing people to work outside their traditional organisational silos. Places are doing it, but somehow we've got to work out how to do a heck of a lot more of that in the short term. And just as an aside, you know, we've been doing winter planning from a population health prevention perspective. It's all vaccination. It's all vaccination, and it's the most vulnerable people who are under-vaccinated. There are real simple things. We don't need to bamboozle ourselves. But if we can now focus on those things, it'll build belief that this whole thing is a venture worth engaging in.
Really interesting. Okay, so we've just got a few minutes. I'm going to come to the front of the stage so I can see people. I'm going to take just a quick set of questions to take a question here, a question here, a question here, and a question. That's 4, because we've only got 5 minutes. And then I'm just going to ask panel, just pick one of those questions, anything from those 4 that you want to kind of respond to. So I'm going to start here in the front row. Here comes the mic.
Jack Tarsing, Chair of Coventry Warwick Partnership Trust. Patricia, what a fantastic report you produced. And for me, the great result was identifying 1% of the NHS budget for prevention. Do you have great hope for that? And what is, we've already heard the one thing in prevention, vaccination, I'm taking that away from my ICB, but what is the one thing you believe that 1% of the budget should be spent on?
And of course, the government's response was to support the spirit of the recommendation, but not the letter of the recommendation, so, or the number of the recommendation. Who's next? Who's got the mic? Yeah, if you've got the mic, you're next, yeah.
Hello, it's Edel Harris. I'm the CEO of Royal Maincap Society, or Maincap as we're commonly known. I appreciate it's a NHS-focused conference, but in the panel discussion just then, I think there was one mention of local authorities and a passing reference to the voluntary sector. So my question really is, how do we ensure that in the integrated care system, the voice of people with lived experience and the critical input of the, I wouldn't call it the voluntary sector, but the charity and independent sector is an equal player, and the power is indeed shifted? That's my question. Thank you.
Who's got the mic now? Yeah.
Harry Dunn, policy intern at NHS Confed, a medical student at the University of Cambridge. So Matthew, you talked earlier about how some of the great work being done in ICS is done at a place level. And we also talked earlier about how during Patricia's time as Secretary of State, there was lots of conversations, the same conversations around prevention and integration. And I guess my question is, it took 20 years in order for power to be devolved appropriately from the centre to systems. Will it take another 20 years for further power to be passed on to a place-based level? Or is there a recognition at ICS that sometimes their role is one of subsidiarity, of passing on power to places? Thank you.
Great question, thank you. And then
Tony Johnson from Health Watch. Could I ask, please, it's now 9 years, we're in the 9th year of devolution of health and social care to Greater Manchester. And with devolution, and that came with a budget of £6.3 billion. With devolution, you normally get a local accountability. I haven't heard the local accountability in relation of quick wins and synergies, which would actually save money to recycle, to improve services and help to boost pay. Could you tell me how we could actually ensure that accountability locally is actually something real?
Okay, last question, and then panel, I'm just going to ask you to just pick one point from those questions. I know that we could spend hours, but we haven't got the time, so yeah.
Thank you for squeezing me in. Mark Moulding, Head of Policy at Skills for Care. I'd really be interested in hearing the panel's views on how the social care sector is best and most effectively woven into the fabric of integrated care systems and integrated care boards, and how near or far we are from achieving that.
Okay, so please, questioners, don't take it personally if you don't get an answer to your question, because I'm only giving the panel 1 minute each to respond. But pick anything from those questions that you particularly want to respond to. And Joe, I'll start with you.
So the one about places and the devolution of power to places, I think, is a really, really important one. I think there's a little bit of work we have to do if we want to do this quickly about the maturity, some sort of maturity index for places, because it would mean devolving actually really large sums of money down to places.
Which of course, is exactly what Amanda says about systems.
Well, exactly. I mean, these are Russian dolls, aren't they? Yeah. These sorts of things. But to go to I'm going to answer two, but they're related. The one about VCSF or charity sector and local authorities, we've got to get some skin in the game for people. And unless we deal with the devolution of resource, why would local authorities and voluntary sector people think there's something in this for us? And that's at the core of relationship, isn't it? Is you can see skin in the game in trying to get at some of these core issues. So I think that needs resolving relatively quickly.
Steve?
Let me take the one on social care very quickly. So point one, we can't achieve the ambitions for ICBs, ICSs without partnerships with social care and, of course, the charity sector as described. We've been careful not to try and prescribe how that is done, but every integrated care board does need a representative from local government on it. That is discharged differently in different systems, and I think we are cautious about being prescriptive about how it should be done. So it is done differently across the country, and you can see where it does work. So Surrey Heartlands is a really good example. They've got a more integrated approach on health and social care training. People get a guaranteed role, 2 roles, and the apprenticeship scheme for nurses there also covers placements in social care. So I think there are examples of the benefits being realised in systems. Is it consistent across the country? No, not yet.
Patricia?
Yeah. Social care as well, please. Look, health and social care employ nearly 3 million people, even more in social care than in the NHS itself. And I think it was much too easy in the run-up to creating ICSs to think that if you had local government at the table, that gave you social care. And it doesn't, because social care providers and the social care workforce have a huge... they're not just there to relieve the pressure on the NHS. They play an absolutely crucial role in supporting some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And at their best, the way they work with individuals and their families to enable people to lead their best possible life, that is something that actually the NHS has a lot to learn from, and they have a huge contribution to make within each integrated care system. I can see that developing already. We recommended in the review how that could be strengthened within our structures. But the critical thing that we also need, on top of what we can do as systems ourselves, is a national workforce plan for social care that in particular addresses the still shockingly low pay and really pretty unacceptable conditions in which far too many of our social care staff work. So that's the one I want to call out right now.
And then last but not least...
I agree with that. I agree with that. It'd be lovely to have the NHS workforce plan, but watch this space, imminent. Probably not surprising from a sitting politician, the public. We talked about reviewing HealthWatch funding in our report. Jury's still out on that. We'll be raising that with Secretary of State next week. I was the minister that did part of the devolution to Manchester, and I'm pleased to be here and hear a bit more about it, and love to chat to you about it. But the public are very much shut out of this still at the moment. Constituents will contact MPs and ask about things to do with services in their area. There is very little knowledge about health and care committees that sit at upper tier authority levels, so Hampshire in my area. They're not bought into that conversation yet. Remember these old health senates that happened when the Lansley reforms went through? The public are not part of this conversation yet. It's early days. We had to get the structure right. Totally understand that. We had to get the ICB membership right in terms of the stakeholders that are around that table, which should include directors of public health, and the government seem to agree, which is the local authority point. But the public are not part of this conversation yet. And MPs, individual constituency MPs, have to step up in this respect. I do it in my area, and lots of MPs do, but not enough do. And they're a key link, I think, in that role.
Really interesting point, Steve.
That's
Thank you.
Great.
Well, look,
Norfolk and Waveney, I have to say. We have really close
Well, I'm
relationships
glad to hear that.
with
I'm
our
glad to hear
MPs
that.
and thousands of our public actually involved in a number of different issues, even over the last year.
so we finished as we started, with me losing control of the panel. But can I thank you all for coming? Can I ask you to thank Joe and Patricia and Steve and Steve? Thank you.